Welcome to the Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee, and today we are looking into the operation of the Windsor Framework. I'd like to thank Anne-Marie, Nichola, Neil and Jennifer for coming today. Could you introduce yourselves and say who you are?
Morning, my name is Anne-Marie Murphy. I'm the Director of Strategy and Emerging Markets in the Consumer Council for Northern Ireland.
Thank you. Nichola.
Good morning, my name is Nichola Mallon. I am Head of Trade and Devolved Policy at Logistics UK. We are a trade association. We have over 20,000 members across the UK, global, national, regional businesses who move freight by road, rail, sea and air.
Neil.
And I'm Neil Johnston. I'm the Director of the Northern Ireland Retail Consortium, part of the BRC. We have over 200 members, about 100 of whom are in Northern Ireland, including every one of the big supermarkets, all of whom who operate in Northern Ireland.
Jennifer.
I'm Jennifer Pheasey, Director of Public Affairs at the Horticultural Trades Association. We have members in the 4 nations of the United Kingdom, and they deliver for gardens and green spaces. They are typically retailers or garden centres, landscapers, manufacturers and suppliers and growers.
Okay, thank you. First question then, what difference has the Windsor Framework made to the movement of goods from GB to Northern Ireland, and what are the remaining challenges that you'd like the government to address? And that's to Nichola.
Well, I would say that the Windsor Framework is an improvement on the Northern Ireland Protocol, but there are some remaining challenges in terms of the movement of goods from GB to NI. I think there is a consensus within our membership that the Windsor Framework was to some extent oversold, and it created a misperception that all of the challenges under the Northern Ireland Protocol have been removed. And that has created 2 effects. It has contributed to a lack of awareness, particularly among GB businesses, of the requirements that must be met under the Windsor Framework. And to some degree, there is a reluctance among some GB-based businesses to trade into Northern Ireland because of the administrative and cost requirements in terms of meeting all of the necessary requirements.
Neil?
I would say that for us, it has, as Nichola says, it was an improvement. However, it has become more and more difficult, I would say, in recent times. I think we perhaps started from the wrong place, and basically we have an overly bureaucratic approach. I think we have successfully achieved what we were required to do, high levels of compliance at the moment. But it's very, very difficult. The nature of our businesses, what's in the back of these trucks, is highly diverse and regularly changing. It's not about that you can get this right and once and be done. It's just a never-ending saga. And from our members' perspective, particularly if you take the likes of Asda, Co-op, Sainsbury's in Iceland, there's no real reason why product going into Northern Ireland, they don't have stores in the Republic. There's no real reason why their products going into Northern Ireland should any more end up in the Republic of Ireland if they were going into a co-op shop in Dorset or anywhere else. But they're being required to fill a vast amount of paperwork. So our members, we would say, are not, what is retailing about? BRC often says it's about offering good prices and value and choice. But actually a lot of it, particularly in food retailing, it's about the trust and integrity that people place in those companies. And yet we don't quite see that level of trust in a proper trusted trader scheme. So, we are saying, we are not Del Boy and Rodney. We are not trying to get our goods secretly over the border into the south. We should be respected to be able to comply with that. I say in the case of Marks and Sparks and Tesco's, who have big operations in the Republic of Ireland, again, they have track and trace technology that they've invested heavily in, and they should be relied upon without vast levels of inspections and paperwork to be able to deliver that. So I think we have, as Nichola says, it's better than before, but we need to be moving forward in a spirit of, that we've achieved a lot, and that perhaps we can look at somehow about ways that we can lessen the load going forward.
Yeah, and Jennifer.
I think for the horticultural sector, the sentiment and ambition of the Windsor Framework was welcome, but the reality and the sort of gulf between headlines and the commercial reality is quite significant. So there were two small steps forward in the Windsor Framework for us. One was the ability to trade seed potatoes from grower to grower. That is not from grower to garden centre or direct to consumer, so that is a small development, but certainly not an unlocking of the seed potato trade. The other one was the introduction of the NIFL scheme, or Northern Ireland Plant Health Labelling Scheme, which presents some administrative easements if you are able to guarantee your movements will stay in Northern Ireland and not move into the south. But that still comes with a significant amount of burdens. There have also been some headlines at various times around the prohibited plants list. So fundamentally, the challenge we have is that Northern Ireland is within the EU's plant health area. The Windsor Framework doesn't change that. Therefore, until that changes, easing many of the challenges that we face in terms of the compliance, the delays, checks, inspections, etc., that will not be addressed until we see a change there. And the Windsor Framework doesn't touch that. Many of the challenges have been outlined by Neil and Nichola are very much experienced by the sector.
And what improvement would the full introduction of the UK Internal Market Scheme after the 31st of March bring compared to present, Nichola?
Well, that will facilitate green lane movements from a customs perspective. From speaking with our members, if you are moving, say, just one or two commodities and it's a very regular journey, so there's no real variance, then you will benefit from the internal market movement information scheme. That is certainly the case. The challenge, though, comes if you're moving vast quantities of different commodities that change on a very regular basis. When we speak to our members about their appetite to avail of simplified processes from a customs perspective from the 31st of March, they say that it's very much in the too hard box in terms of their perspective. So there is challenges. I think from the logistics industry perspective, we are very concerned in respect of the changes to parcel movements from the 31st of March, because currently, parcels move under the waiver, so there are no new requirements. But from the 31st of March, there are significant new processes that will be required if you're moving consumer parcels, but particularly if you're moving business-to-business parcels. And so we have been working with HMRC, who have improved their communications of late, but there is a need for a much greater awareness campaign in the last remaining number of weeks to raise awareness and help with preparedness.
Okay, and Neil?
Well, I would echo that. We say we would have great concerns about the 31st of March. I mean, given the complexity of what's being moved, we have a situation where one of the supermarkets is filling in tens of thousands of customs declarations at a cost of $1.5 million. So, if you replicate that across the sector, it's a significant burden. And to say we have concerns that on the 31st of March everything is, although we are assured by members that they are in a position to go, I think it's highly likely that we will notice problems.
And Neil, you say checks under the Retail Movement Scheme increased in 2024 and led to additional delays. Why is that then, if given that the percentage of goods subject to identity checks has decreased?
That's a very good question. I think we would like to know. I think we haven't got to a proper situation where, as I said at the beginning, that we've got a proper trusted trader scheme and that people seem to be being subject to checks. We've had nearly all the supermarkets have had either attempts or actual trucks being sent back to Scotland, which in my mind should never happen. And we haven't got a situation where the level of checks has been reduced, and in many cases it's increasing. I think Nichola may have more evidence on that in the actual detail, but we have seen a large number of checks. Statistically, it seems to be very hard to get a grip on what that actual percentage of checks is, but certain members seem to feel the heat more than others. Despite the fact that we were assured that nobody would be put on the naughty step for failure to apply 1 week wouldn't mean that you were singled out going forward. So I think it's disappointing. I say, particularly as it was stressed at the beginning, the risk of any of these products from the supermarkets that don't have southern premises going astray is negligible. So why do we have to have these level of checks? Is certainly a question that we're asking repeatedly.
And Nichola, did you have anything to add there on the data?
Yeah, Chair. I mean, some of our members, excuse me, report a very positive experience of moving under the Northern Ireland Retail Movement Scheme. We do have other members, large household names, who are experiencing high percentage of checks. So I would echo Neil's comments in that it would be appreciated if we had more detail around why vehicles are stopped, and to assist with business understanding and preparedness. We also know from some of our members that they have goods that qualify for the NIRMS route, but they are choosing to continue to go down the red lane. Why? Because they report that it's easier in many ways. They also report that it is much more predictable. And of course, they have the additional choice of serving both the EU and the Northern Ireland market. But I would emphasise Neil's point around kind of having a more trusted approach to checks, and where we can, maximise that, because certainly our members are working tirelessly to ensure that they are compliant. But once a lorry is held up at the port, that has significant knock-on consequences. It has consequences for the depot that the lorry is due to arrive at, which then is subsequently distributed to different stores for online shops, for example. It has knock-on effects for that driver in terms of their scheduling, and it also has knock-on effects for the logistics operations, because they have to work as efficiently as possible and keep all vehicles moving. So it does have challenges.
Thank you. And Simon Hall.
Thank you, Chair. Ms Murphy, I suppose this may be specifically to you, but what, if any, have been the main benefits or challenges reported by consumers in Northern Ireland in relation to the framework?
I suppose consumers aren't aware of whether it's EU exit or the Windsor Framework or the implementation, what exactly is causing them difficulties. And we have done research over the last 4 years, as included in my written brief. And the key areas of concerns for consumers and what they're really invested in is price increases, is making an increase in price increases, the economy of Northern Ireland, maintaining a frictionless border on the island of Ireland, the introduction of customs checks and what that might mean for products getting to them, and whether this will increase the cost of products. Our recent Pulse survey that we did just in December, there was both concerns from consumers about product availability and also about delivery and delays. So that is a main area of concern. I think food prices, food availability, the availability of products is also the largest area. Now, it's not helped by the fact that the last 4 years has been one of the most complex economic environments that consumers have had to deal with. So it's very hard for them to unpick exactly which of the issues and complexities is equating to the problems that they're having. But largely our research would show us that whenever it comes to EU exit, the majority of them are saying that food affordability and availability is being impacted by EU exit, Windsor Framework, and the outworkings of this.
We just explore those concerns just a little bit. Are they concerns for the future? Are they concerns now? And are you able to sort of either identify certain strands where those concerns of availability are manifesting themselves, or where they fear they may?
Certainly they are a concern now, both from a price perspective and certain products being available or their choices on shelves. Food prices are also something that consumers, it's the issue that they're concerned about most in the future. I think it's also worthwhile to say at this point that parcel movements and actually being able to get products from Great British suppliers, also an area of concern for consumers. We're seeing that through an awful lot of our research. Categories that are causing them concern are home and furniture. They are garden plants and seeds, they're clothing and footwear, they are health and beauty products, and technology and entertainment. So there's a wide range of areas that are causing concern for consumers and experiences of consumers not being able to get retailers to deliver to them. I think it's also worthwhile mentioning at this point that, I'm sure you're all aware Northern Ireland is got a very high percentage of micro businesses with under 10 employees. They oftentimes react and work in exactly the same way as consumers, with their understanding of the arrangements, with their capacity to be able to deal with them. So that's also an area of concern for those businesses, not being able to buy from suppliers in Great Britain, and what they do about that is also an area of concern.
And have you noticed, has there been any sort of rejigging of the supply chain in terms of the transport logistics in order to try to ameliorate against?
I don't think I would be best placed to answer. I'm unclear. I'm unsure.
That might be one from Ms. Mallon.
Yeah, I mean, anecdotally, we would pick up that supply chains have changed. The challenge, though, is economies of scale. So if you're looking to source on the island of Ireland, for example, you're not able to avail of the same economies of scale that you would be able to do if you were sourcing from the GB market. So certainly we would be picking that up from some of our members.
I would echo that. I think, there are certain products that have come through the south, but largely those big GB-based operations, massive economies of scale. And I'd say what we've lost here really in all of this is that once upon a time we had a British and Irish market for food, and Ireland, the north and south, benefited hugely from that, as did the rest of the UK. We don't have that now. Supermarkets have looked at bringing things in through the Republic, but you're talking about 20-30% more expensive, so it's basically a complete non-runner.
For horticulture, so we're over 90% SMEs, so we have seen many supply chains diverted. And as one garden centre said to me last week, based in Northern Ireland, I just want to get plants that I've been getting for many years from my own country, and I can't. And so I think absolutely, and we have seen therefore businesses look to invest elsewhere, and they've looked to set up perhaps hubs in the EU, whether that be in Dublin or on the continent, and that is diverting investment and jobs that could be here and should be here.
And can I add that in addition to supply chain responses, one of the business models that's under a lot of pressure is grippage for logistics. And obviously that's quite a unique model in the sense that you're moving multiple different loads for different consumers. So the administrative and cost burden is much more significant. That is under challenge, and that is concerning from a logistics point of view, but also for the sole traders and the SMEs that grippage serves. So one of the things that we've been discussing with HMRC is the possibility of a trusted haulier scheme, for example, for the grippage movement, yes, which would enable the haulier to have more time to get all of the information that it needs to keep the goods moving. So if we could get movement on that, I think that would be a considerable easement in terms of the pressures in the logistics industry.
And just on that sort of wider point, you mentioned HMRC and a sort of slight change of approach. Yeah. What are you sort of picking up as the sort of stock answer, if you will, from HMG? Is it we're having next steps, evolutionary discussions with the EU, so just sort of bide your time, or we're going to, pat our head and rub our tummies at the same time and try to finesse Windsor as well?
I mean, from a logistics point of view, HMRC have definitely improved their communications in the last number of months. They've been holding a series of webinars on the changes, and they've been holding a series of roundtables in GB, which is important, and we have been asking for that. Yes. So that has been an improvement. Certainly we have picked up a change in tone. The UK-EU reset that's spoken about has led to a more positive approach to things. I think what our industry would be concerned about is that in the bigger picture, and there are very big issues in the geopolitical space and in the trading space, that Northern Ireland isn't forgotten about, and that where we can, we find easements, and we try where we can to reduce friction and to ensure there is a smooth flow of trade.
I mean, rest assured, Northern Ireland is never forgotten about. Can I just turn to dual market access, which many of us back in the day trumpeted as a very unique, well, you can't be very unique, you're either unique, it was a unique proposition, which if exploited and understood well, could be deliver some significant benefit. Has business benefited from that dual access?
I think at this stage...
Or is it a process?
Yeah, so at this stage I think it is difficult to say. What we have noticed is that there is increased activity within Northern Ireland in terms of looking to sell Northern Ireland's unique UPS. For example, InvestNI have established a dual market access forum which Logistics UK sits on. But there are still a couple of issues that we need to be focused on. Number one is that among some EU member states and globally, there is at times a lack of understanding that Northern Ireland is part of the EU single market. It is still considered to be within, to not be, and that creates barriers and we lose opportunities for trade. We also think that there needs to be better partnership working by the Northern Ireland Executive, the UK Government and the EU to sell the unique market access that Northern Ireland has. And Logistics UK would be supportive of the call by the Institute of Directors for the EU to establish a Northern Ireland economic envoy, much like the role that Joe Kennedy played from a US perspective. And there are opportunities. I mean, in the issue of organic products, we have some members who are moving organic products from China to Northern Ireland and then distributing them much wider across the EU. Government needs to be working with industry to understand, yes, what the barriers are, but also what the opportunities are, and then building on that. The focus to date has been very much on compliance with the Windsor Framework, and that continues to be a big priority for our membership, but we need to all put our shoulder to the wheel now in terms of realising the economic and trading opportunities.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Gavin.
Thanks very much, Chair. Good morning, everyone. I think just clearly we're not in the EU single market, but we align to EU single market rules on goods, which is particularly important for logistics, but I think some of those EU folks that believe we're not are right. That we're not in the single market. In fairness to all four of you and from different perspectives, you come to an occasion like this and you're asked to reflect on that which has come and maybe some aspirations for that which is to come. And this is a moving feast. We know with Windsor Framework it brought forward changes and they were all had different implementation dates. On parcels, for example, the first aspiration was 31st October. North were not in the right place, they weren't communicating well, it was welcomed broadly by business, the delay, and 31st of March is still not guaranteed, but if it's not for 31st of March, 1st April, it could be 1st May.
Yes.
It seems to be the direction of travel. But all of you in different ways are highlighting issues that you have come across that you see as barriers, and I think it's right that those are explored. Can I ask, and maybe just go from Anne-Marie right through to Jennifer, have you engaged with Lord Murphy's review?
Not as yet. I suppose the Consumer Council is well embedded whenever it comes to Northern Ireland government departments, UK government departments and the EU. I expect we will get it and would be happy to do so because we have a lot of very valuable consumer research and also micro-business research that I think would be really pertinent, but not as yet.
Okay, thank you.
Not as yet, but we stand willing to participate in that review.
We have exchanged emails, but nothing as yet. But I say, just if I would carry on from your point in that you mentioned the parcels on 31st of March. For me, July and phase 3 labelling is much more pressing on the horizon. So,
in fairness to colleagues, both issues are going to come up.
Okay.
So.
Not as yet, but we're working with government through the Horticultural Working Group to see what opportunities there are to further ease some of the challenges that I've set out already.
Thank you. I think I would encourage you to do so at this stage, and I'll pass back.
Thank you. Katrina Murray.
Thank you. I want to look at the internal market guarantee, the stated aim of being 80% of freight movements treated as not risk. Probably going to you first, Nichola. Is this attainable for your members?
Our understanding is that the 80% internal market guarantee was based on data that HMRC had about movements. I think in respect of the guarantee and in respect of the independent monitoring panel, we're still waiting on publication of detailed terms of reference. We did welcome the appointment of the 3 members and the recent meeting with the Northern Ireland Secretary of State. But I think it would be important to start to see some of the detail in terms of the role and remit and how issues like the internal market guarantee will be enacted.
What differences could it make for businesses in Northern Ireland?
Anything that can be done should be done to ease trade and maximise the movement of goods from GB to Northern Ireland. It is our biggest market. So we are keen to work with the Independent Monitoring Panel. We're also very keen to work with Intertrade UK. And we're keen to also see how all of that interfaces, how all of those organisations or bodies work together to ensure that there is meaningful engagement with industry, but also that we are addressing barriers where possible and maximising the opportunities.
Neil, what do you...
Well, I think where we are at the moment is, this is like a swan on a lake. The reason that consumers haven't noticed anything is because Nichola's members and my members are peddling furiously to comply and achieved a lot. I think, I wouldn't want to be overly negative. I think, we've had a lot to achieve and a lot of hurdles to overcome, but we've succeeded in doing that. But I say whether going forward, I think it's going to become more and more difficult, particularly, say, as mentioned before, the phase 3 labelling. They're branded products that we cannot tell suppliers to brand them for Northern Ireland, and the government, to my mind, hasn't really been clear on how they are going to resolve that problem. They say they've taken the powers to require those producers to label for Northern Ireland, but it's not very clear as to how that will happen. So come July, it's highly likely that there will be gaps on shelves, household products that people are used to having on the shelves in Northern Ireland. May well, I hope not. We've had this before with phase 1, phase 2, and we try and minimise that to an absolute minimum, but, there may be products come the end of July that disappear. Part of the reason being, in terms of getting guidance from government, it's always been a case of too little, too late. We understand all the reasonings behind that, and to try and get the guidance finessed and sort of agreed with the EU where possible. But it means that, for example, there are many shelf-stable products that are in supply chains now that will still be in supply chains at the end of July. So there's no prospect of them being properly labelled, not for EU, by the 31st of July.
What role would you see the Intertrade body having within that?
Well,
what would you like it to do?
I would like to see it, engage with government to say, at the end of the day, it's for government to set the parameters of how we ensure that consumers in Northern Ireland still have the same broad range and value of products that the consumers in GB have.
Jennifer, how would you see the Intertrade UK body affecting your membership?
For us at the moment, we are slightly different because we're handling SPS goods that are typically subject to significant numbers of checks, and we have the NIFL scheme, which for us is so the different ways that you can move plants are you either move it with the NIFL scheme. And that means that you have to then guarantee it will stay in Northern Ireland. You can move it with a phytosanitary certificate, which is essentially a kind of red lane approach where it could, where you can't guarantee where it'll end up. Or there is a small easement around moving with under 2 kilo parcels, but that does still require a phytosanitary certificate. One of the key issues that we have and why we potentially have not seen the NIFL scheme being taken up so much is the definition of when a good becomes a Northern Ireland good. So this is a good example of where greater guidance and information around these various schemes or initiatives would be really helpful. So that issue essentially is a grower may sell a small plant to a grower in Northern Ireland, and we don't know how long they may grow that for, and then we need a definition. Okay, when does that then become a Northern Ireland good and therefore is able to travel freely? So for us, there's quite a few things that would actually a key priority for us to make it easier, have that greater guidance and definitions, to perhaps see greater take-up of some of schemes which may have slightly easier admin burdens. But going back to your initial question, I think there's lots of different challenges on the table for us to work with and really understand and navigate all of these different nuances and bodies, which is really quite complex. not only for for us who sit in a kind of national position, but for individual businesses, especially if you're an SME. Just understanding all of this is a really, really challenging situation.
Hannah.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask about the new parcel requirements from the end of this month. And Nichola, you had touched on that already briefly. How prepared are businesses and carriers for that? And also, how has the communication been about the new requirements?
Well, we did welcome the delay to the 31st of March. Or a slightly later date than that, if that is what transpires. But we do remain concerned about the level of awareness, particularly for business-to-business parcel movements, because there are new processes that have to be put in place. Either the sender or the receiver has to be UKIMS authorised. There are restrictions in the movement of some SPS goods. So, for example, if I'm ordering pet food online, or I'm ordering an afternoon tea set from Devon, that won't be able to move through the UK carrier scheme. So there's a lot of new processes. In Northern Ireland, we find that our members are very switched on. They've been following this over the last number of years. But we still think there is more work to be done in terms of raising awareness among GB businesses. And as I say, HMRC has been carrying out a series of roundtables to do just that. I suppose this is the aspect of the Windsor Framework that really comes into people's lives because of the rise in e-commerce. But certainly our members are spending a lot of time engaging with their GB customer base and GB hauliers, making sure that they're aware of what needs to be done from the go-live date.
Neil, and might come to you, Anne, after.
Yeah. In contrast, I suppose, to Nichola, with the smaller ones, my guys are the bigger guys, so they're shifting a huge amount of material. Whether it's Sainsbury's or Next or Marks and Sparks or Amazon. Amazon are members of ours, and they will all say that they have their processes in place and are quietly confident. I personally will believe it when I see it, because it's just very complex, and just the nature of the number of parcels being moved and the number of people supplying in. So I'm sure the companies think that they have everything, but they're reliant on what's coming into them. We shall see, I think, is the answer.
And if I could just add, HMRC has said that their approach will be one of, pragmatism and education and support. And we've been engaging with HMRC to ensure that pragmatic approach is translated into operations on the ground through border force and so forth. And we're being reassured that there won't be any changes. It will all be risk-led, intelligence-led. But it's very important that the policy approach and operations on the ground are aligned.
Anne-Marie, I'm sure you, Consumer Council, have heard from a lot of particularly very small businesses and recipients who've faced challenges so far. How do you think people are prepared for it, and how have the communications been, do you think?
I suppose the difficulty about this is that Northern Ireland consumers will be on the receiving end of these arrangements. So, it is going to be a grandmother sending a gift to her grandchild in Northern Ireland. It's going to be a business sending something to a consumer in Northern Ireland. It's going to be a consumer in the UK returning a product to a business in Northern Ireland. So there's 3 different processes already, and our parcels research had already identified on online shopping that there has been some difficulties in relation to delivering to Northern Ireland, either by businesses deciding that they're not going to deliver to Northern Ireland, or it's too difficult, or by some mistakes or in the process. It isn't going to be business as usual from the 31st of March, and whilst we don't have any evidence that is going to adversely impact parcels, we really believe that monitoring needs to be done, and Royal Mail have recently consulted on the changes to their terms of service, which means that if a parcel coming to Northern Ireland from GB doesn't have the data requirements, they reserve the right to stop that or not deliver it, etc. So monitoring of that, ensuring those processes work, testing those processes are really important to ensure that the recipient sitting in Northern Ireland gets their parcel. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. We have worked and spoken to and do speak to regularly Royal Mail, HMRC, Post Office. We have statutory remit whenever it comes to post. They are all reassuring us that those processes are in place and they are ready. So that is where we are at, but we will continue to work in this space with them.
Did you have anything, Jennifer, that you wanted to add on that?
Yeah, the mail order situation for plants, bulbs, seeds, etc. is basically zero. So you can't really send anything. And that's because the requirements would essentially mean that a consumer would need to be a professional operator to receive that parcel, or you would need to send potentially something very small, a couple of packets of seeds would require a phytosanitary certificate, which it's just not commercially viable to spend that time doing that. I spoke to one online retailer in the horticultural sector, of course, who said to me they would estimate it would be a surcharge of £10 per parcel to add on to anything to cover all of the admin burdens. That is just not going to be, that's just not going to be paid for the value of the goods that would be sent. And also, it would potentially mean that it would take 2 to 3 weeks for that to arrive by the time you've gone through all of the certification, which is just not what consumers expect or should have as the service level agreement. They should expect much quicker service as we do now. So I think for us, the mail order issue, which is one of the sort of key challenges in our sector, we would really like to work through and see if there might be an opportunity, potentially under NIFL scheme, to see if there could be some potentially easement or look at how we might be able to work with that scheme, which has slightly lighter admin burden to send direct to consumers. But at the moment, it needs to go from a professional operator to a professional operator. The other option is that you then invest and set up a hub in Northern Ireland, but given what we've just talked about already, so you export to yourself and then you distribute, that would be a huge investment, and for the size of the market and the types of businesses and SMEs we're talking about, it's just not an option. So I think there's no quick win within this space, but we hope to keep working with government to see what might be possible.
Okay, so looking to the bigger wins, for those challenges and the others that you have discussed with us today that your businesses are facing, how would an EU-UK veterinary and SPS agreement mitigate or change all that for you? I might start with you, Neil.
Well, that would be a completely different context. So yeah, it's very much a case of starting from somewhere completely different. Mm-hmm. It would definitely remove the need for a lot of the checks, obviously.
Could you quantify it? I mean,
it'd be very difficult to quantify, and I think it certainly isn't. It isn't a silver bullet because there would still be a lot of other requirements. In addition to that, and what hasn't been touched on is EU divergence in other areas. So. Well, it would certainly be a positive step in that we could. I would like to say we could remove all the not for EU labelling and a lot of that is a huge burden to members and vastly reduce the admin and bureaucracy. So it would certainly be a significant step in a positive direction for my members if there was an SPS agreement. Yeah.
It would be extremely welcome. And we would be looking for an SPS agreement that obviously addresses GBNI trade for plant seeds, bulbs, etc. But for us, the fundamental point would be that would have to include the recognition of each other's and respect for each other's plant health regimes. And that would ultimately unlock many of the challenges that I've outlined. We do not want to see at-border checks. Our products are perishable. Any delay adds damage, risk, cost, etc. So that would be one thing we certainly would like to see removed. Furthermore is the need to have things like phytosanitary certificates gone. That is, nobody's benefiting from that except it's, feeding paperwork and admin burdens. And I should say quite often it's brought up with us around biosecurity risks and concerns. We had national measures in place when we were members of the EU to address some of the risks around pests and diseases, so that we are an island and all EU member states have that situation. So we would hope that we would still be able to have a robust system of biosecurity here. And our businesses, it's absolutely a top issue for them, biosecurity. Of course it is. So we would hope to be able to find an outcome of a negotiated SPS arrangement that would be able to achieve minimal admin burdens, but still have a robust biosecurity system in place.
Unfortunately, we went through a few years where senior politicians enjoyed saying, we don't care about the rules are really boring, all this red tape is stifling businesses, and I think that undermined, I suppose, confidence in biosecurity and other standards rules, certainly for Britain. But Nichola, would that affect your members, do you think?
Logistics UK would be very supportive of a comprehensive SPS agreement, because it would reduce or remove the friction on the movement of those goods from GB to NI. But we are a UK-wide trade association, so it would also address the friction on GB EU movements as well, which is crucially important. Of course, we still have issues around customs that our members have to engage in, so that's a separate matter. But certainly on the SPS movements, it would lead to a reduction in friction on trade.
I just want to come back in there and say to emphasise, really, it's not just also, as Nichola says, it's GB to Northern Ireland, it's GB to EU, and it's also EU into GB. You know, probably should emphasise the integrated nature of particularly the food supply business. The Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland are huge suppliers of food to GB. Obviously, there's not a problem from Northern Ireland into GB, but anything that can ease the movement of food throughout these islands, it would certainly be beneficial.
I think what consumers want is they want affordability, they want choice, they want access, and you know, if that is the outcome of that, then you know we would welcome it.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks, Claire. I just wanted to pick up on the not for EU labelling, and you have spoken about this, Neil. You know, saying about products already in the supply chain, not all, you know, properly labelled, gaps on shelves of household products. What impact has the not for EU labelling requirements for goods moving from GB to Northern Ireland under the retail movement scheme had on businesses so far?
Well, it's been a huge imposition because you know you've essentially got a situation where suppliers have to have separate print runs for labelling. The requirements in shop for posters and edge of shelf labelling as well are quite burdensome. Primarily because you know we said from the outset that none of this was necessary, that all of the monitoring and control of the supply chains could be done by our members. We didn't need the labelling, and really it's not a requirement that we think should be there. I mean, we could monitor all of these products without all of this. I say it strikes me as someone who grew up on the border and goes home very regularly to see in a shop in Castledurg, not for consumption in the EU, when you're 3 miles from the border. Now, thankfully, the good citizens of Castledurg and Donegal clearly pay no attention to this. But so, what purpose is it serving to tell somebody not to buy not to eat the sausage roll they buy in Castledurg and Castlefin? It's slightly crazy, you know. But in terms of cost, it's you know you're having to separate out, having to run separate logistic chains, wrap pallets in plastic that says not for EU, including over the top of the cage, to put them in the truck to send them to Northern Ireland, when there is no risk of that truck. When I see regularly a 40-footer from the co-op that's come from the north of England reaches Castledurg in mid-morning, there's no danger of these products going into the Republic commercially. They are being taken into the Republic in large scale by consumers. So it's just been a huge imposition. To date, though, largely because it's been on supermarket unbranded products that the supermarkets can control in phase 1 and phase 2, and it's been rolled out gradually. The consumers have seen very little change on the shelves. So it's been a huge imposition on my members and on their suppliers. But thankfully, consumers are probably largely unaware to date. Come July, there's a vast range of products then that come under phase 3, and quite a lot of those are branded products. So the suppliers would make the decision. So if you're a GB yogurt supplier, you have to say that the 2% that goes into Northern Ireland, we have to put, or even a French cheese manufacturer, ironically, has to put not for EU if the cheese has been sent into GB and then on to Northern Ireland. It's an administrative and financial burden that members could do without, and consumers could do without. I mean, all of this is adding to cost.
Yeah. Nichola, do you have anything to add?
No, I think Neil has covered it. The only thing that I would make was there was a situation where there was the anticipated decision to extend the not for EU labelling GB-wide, and Northern Ireland, so it was UK-wide labelling. That was due to take effect on the 1st of October, and it was only on the 30th of September that there was confirmation that that wasn't to proceed. And that did cause a lot of frustration across our membership, just that lack of clarity and the last minute confirmation of decision making. So just to add that point to what Neil has said.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Alpington.
Thank you very much for those comprehensive answers. In fact, your answers were so comprehensive that you've kind of answered. You've actually already answered some of the questions that I had. Neil, you mentioned so far that you think, in your opinion, consumers have seen little change in terms of the products on shelf. So I wonder if I might initially turn to Anne-Marie and put that same question to you from your perspective, from your organisation. Have you noticed? Have you had any reports of changing availability of products because of that not for EU labelling so far? And would you concur or defer away from what Neil has said about what may come in July?
The only thing we have asked over the last while about not for EU labelling is whether consumers have noticed it or not. And we did that over the last 2 years because it just surfaced as a new output from the Windsor Framework. There has been a marginal improvement in consumers noticing that, I think from late 40s to early 50%. But it provides us with no information as to whether there's any effect to product availability. We haven't aligned our research to not for EU labelling and general product availability, and that that may become clearer later on. But it was purely and simply just about their awareness of that as a concept and construct that they're seeing in the supermarket.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to pick up on that particular issue of availability in the first instance, or do you feel that that's been adequately covered?
I think that's been covered. I think there is a nervousness with the parcel changes that we may see some temporary withdrawal from the Northern Ireland market as people are getting used to new processes and businesses do. Obviously, when you have additional processes and requirements, that increases your cost of doing business. If you look at the logistics industry, on average it operates on a very tight profit margin, about 2.5%. So the ability of our industry to continue to absorb costs, we have the necessity of crossing the Irish Sea, which is an additional cost not faced by some of our GB-based counterparts. You have Windsor Framework requirements. Obviously there's the introduction or the increase in the employer's contribution to national insurance as a result of the budget. So all of these things are adding to the cost of doing business. And we are very mindful of the Northern Ireland consumer. The Northern Ireland consumer has the lowest disposable income compared to anywhere else in the UK, but costs have to be picked up somewhere, and inevitably to some degree it will be passed on to the consumer.
Just to add to that one about the costs, Nichola's very comprehensively listed them, other than packaging costs. We have directors coming in at the end of this year that retail estimate will cost about £2 billion to address those. So it's just a cumulative burden of all of this, both in GB in general, because again retail is a very small margins. So there's a lot of costs coming down between national insurance, etc., and then in Northern Ireland, in addition to that, you've got Windsor Framework costs. It's difficult.
Sorry, could you just restate that figure? That 2 billion.
That's what
relates directly to
estimate that the EPR directives, the packaging directives coming in the autumn, will add 2 billion to the cost of doing business. Because basically it's a new arrangements for dealing with waste. Yeah. So none of these things we as an industry object to in isolation. They say it's just to emphasise it's the cumulative burden of all of these things at this time, and prices are it's very difficult to keep prices down if your costs are rising.
Yeah. Nichola, you mentioned the frustration that businesses felt with that September into October, the one-day announcement that those labelling rules weren't going to be extended across the rest of GB. The government said that they would monitor the supply of goods from GB into NI. and then might look again at whether that UK-wide labelling would take place. Are you aware, any of you, of the monitoring regime that the UK government have in place in order to kind of check that homework, if you like?
I'm not aware of the specifics of it.
I think that's something they want to discuss with us. I'm not clear in my mind how this is going to work. You know, are we going to say, so the government has taken the powers, I believe, to basically to force a GB supplier to do not for EU labelling. I'm not a lawyer just as to how that is going to work out and how that's supposed to be monitored. You know, I don't think it's the job of my members to report to government that certain suppliers are we supposed to dob them in? I'm just not sure how this is supposed to work.
And you're not aware of anyone of the UK government asking for that information to be
asking for that information? I think you know it's intended that we will discuss that with them about how we would envisage that going forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gavin Robinson.
Thanks, Chair. I think this is an important conversation just right now. And I think, Neil, earlier you highlighted very helpfully the disproportionality of a lot of the arrangements, and it goes back to that initial suggestion that everything was at risk of onward transit and potentially harmful to the single market if it was moving from GB to NI, and everything then has been working back from that point. On labelling itself, the commitment in Safeguarding the Union Command Paper was to be UK-wide, so that there wasn't a divergence of trade, so that there wasn't an inhibition to supply into the Northern Ireland market. It was very clear, and government did indicate that that's not what they wish to do, but they haven't passed the legislation yet to assume the power, and more particularly they haven't discussed anywhere what the trigger point is, and the trigger point can only come after they assess the information. So they say it's because industry, which you represent, Neil, were saying that they just didn't want it in GB, that it was a burdensome thing, and they are blaming industry to say that's why we're not proceeding. Can I just ask for a reflection?
Well, to be fair, BRC were not in favour of GB labelling because other members who don't operate in Northern Ireland, Morrison's, Waitrose, to require them to GB label seemed the definition of a sledgehammer to crack a nut. And I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of that going on here. You know, GB labelling perhaps was the British government's sledgehammer to solve the problem of how you ensure Northern Ireland is supplied. Nobody has worked out the way of cracking this problem.
So a lot of your members did very easily adapt their out of date, their best before date printing.
That is
but it's on the labels.
That's
and it's printed.
Largely what it's done. Yes,
That's quite a simple process.
That's relatively simple, and that is what. If you pick up a tub of margarine, it'll be printed along the side. If you pick up cheese or whatever, it will be, as you say, where the best before date is. So that's where that is done. But if you are to incorporate that and to say we have not for EU labelling across the whole of the United Kingdom, then a lot of BRC members would say we don't need to do that, we don't supply Northern Ireland, and then other members would say why can't we just supply Northern Ireland, you know, without this labelling. So it goes to the point of we did say don't go down this labelling, not for EU labelling to begin with.
Yes. So the disproportionality point, which you started with, which I referred to, is the sort of thing that I think Lord Murphy needs to hear about.
Yes, and certainly.
There are these wider conversations.
It's always been our position that we didn't need to go down the road for labelling because you reach these conundrums. I mean, how do you solve this problem of ensuring, if you want to ensure that all products put in, all relevant products put in under phase 1, 2 and 3 in Northern Ireland is not for EU label, how do you ensure that when you are imposing on suppliers in Britain and in Europe, continental Europe, a situation whereby for a very, very small run of their product, they are going to have to label it differently. It's an administrative and cost burden.
And that's something I'm very aware of, is the cumulative burden cost, which is then passed down to the consumer, or will be. Have you got any figures? I'm thinking Anne-Marie, May, Nichola, Neil. What does this actually look like? Because you've broken it down when you've been speaking around packaging and recycling and the labelling. Do we have any figures? Is there any kind of evidence out there of what it is going to cost the consumer?
Not really, because basically, my members are sort of quite circumspect about sharing what they regard as commercially sensitive information, but also, to be honest, at the moment, all of the considerable costs of complying with the Windsor Framework are just being sucked up centrally by those businesses, and they happen to be large businesses, and I'm very conscious that I'm representing very large businesses here. There are a lot of other businesses for whom this will be a massive cost. So we have people in all of those companies, all those big retailers, who are pretty much dedicated to solving these problems and working on these problems on a weekly, if not daily basis. So there are considerable costs, but I don't have a figure, unfortunately, for what it looks like in terms, because it's very, very hard to, in some, as Gavin points out, in terms of if you just actually put "not for you" in the label, then that's fine, but it's doing that twice. How again, quantifying the cost of having two separate runs, say, is very difficult.
Interesting to have a case study, though, of maybe a smaller business where you've got kind of, national insurance contributions, packaging, recycling, labelling. I just wondered if that work would be useful in a policy sphere. Nichola, would that be something that can be done?
Yeah, I'm sure you could get an anonymised case study. I mean, as Neil said, members are reluctant to share commercial information, but there definitely is a need to be monitoring the cost impact on businesses and the consumer. Question is that a role that will be looked at by the independent monitoring panel? Who will be looking at? And from our perspective, we're not clear what organisation is looking at. Yes, we can go around our members and we can get anonymised case studies, but we need someone up in the helicopter looking at the wider economic picture.
Yeah, and I agree, but it would be a very useful tool to have and very powerful for government to see that. Okay.
And just on that point, I say, I'm regularly on call with all of the representatives of those supermarkets, with DEFRA, who all work very collegiately and very cooperatively with DEFRA. And then they go out of the room, and then they are vicious rivals of each other. We've got to remember that this is probably one of the most competitive industries there is, the supermarkets. So they keep their figures very close to their chest, although they work very collegiately to try and solve problems too.
Yeah, no, understood. Simon.
Thank you, Chair. Two shortage questions, both to Ms Pheasey, if I may. The first is on the plant health label scheme. Obviously, as a committee, we will make some recommendations, observations back to government based on what we hear during these sessions. I might restrict you to two, but what two improvements would you like to see to it that would make it operate better?
With the NIFL scheme, one of the key challenges has been around communication and actually understanding it. It is complex. So for us, we think there is a significant opportunity, and we are very willing to work with government to engage with all of those in the supply chain who need to understand what's required of them, whether they are the exporter or the importer. So we think there is absolutely a communications piece on the NIFL side of things.
Is that principally targeted to nurseries?
No, I think that would be to garden centres as well. So growers' garden centres. I think the full supply chain, and I think that would be something we would, talking to my members, communication and understanding complexity, and I think you've heard that from others, is absolutely one of the key things that we would like to see much more support for. The second thing around the NIFL scheme would be to look at, can we do something around consumers? And at the moment it's for B2B, and is there something we can do with that scheme around consumers? And I don't know if that's possible within the legal framework, but that's something we would certainly like to explore.
Okay. And by that you mean sort of direct, sort of mail order?
We would love to be able to resume mail order from GB to NI consumers, absolutely.
And could you just give us a word or two on your assessment of the progress of the horticulture working group with regard, I think, specifically trying to resolve outstanding issues in relation to the movement of plants GB to NI?
Absolutely. So the Horticultural Working Group stems from an initial interaction between HTA and its members with the Cabinet Office, Northern Ireland Office, where we were setting out some of our challenges and frustrations, particularly around mail order, but also the other issues that we've talked about. That group has been relatively slow in terms of its progress, partially because of the time it fell within the political cycle and the election. But in September of last year, the Northern Ireland Secretary, Hilary Benn, and this was very welcome, reconfirmed that group would be continuing, and it has done. It's relatively slow moving. I think that's frustrating for many of those involved, but we are very welcoming of that group, and it does have a work programme going forward. However, it's constrained by the legal framework, particularly in relation to the question around the sort of prohibited plants or high-risk plants. This is a separate process. So this is something that is run by EFSA, so the European Food Safety Authority, and a dossier needs to be submitted, and that's done by DEFRA AFA, jointly with industry representatives, to make a submission of a dossier of which they would like a plant or a species to be removed from that list. That can take up to 2 years. I think it was birches, a couple of birches came off that list in February. That had taken just under 2 years to get those progressed. So I think I can happily provide the latest list in terms of what's still on there. We have made some progress. That list is coming down, but that is separate to the Horticultural Working Group. That's run through a different process.
And can I just probe? I take the point entirely, the disruption of the general election and the dust settling, etc. But how often has the working group met? I took away from your first answer to my question that it's intending to meet but hasn't.
It has met several times. The momentum has started as of the last, I would say, probably month or so. Okay. So we met, I think it's a couple of weeks ago. We will meet again at the end of April. So roughly every 2 months. That is the intention now. So, but it is constrained given the legal parameters that we're operating in.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Chair, may I just ask
may.
Very quickly? Lord of the Rings is a good example of a place where trees can uproot themselves, walk across the border and cause trouble over a border. Are you
It's a work of fiction, Gabby.
Not see that coming.
Are you aware of any other plant that's capable of doing that?
Groot.
I assume the answer is no.
Railway children?
You're right,
Jennifer,
you're right about the torturous process around declassification or removal of individual species. There was considerable lobbying by the Woodlands Trust, who obviously plant trees throughout the United Kingdom, and they ordinarily would have got their trees from Scotland for Northern Ireland, and that is problematic at the moment. They make the point that they would rather have Scottish trees in Scotland, Welsh trees in Wales, English trees in England, and Northern Irish trees in Northern Ireland, so they're in the process of creating a nursery. And often people say it's because of the European Union, but they're saying they just want trees from a local area grown in a local area. They lament the fact that they can't get trees from Scotland, though they're happy because they want Northern Ireland ones, but they can get them from Amsterdam and other parts of Europe where biosecurity is a real issue and disease spreads quite considerably. Is that something that the working group have considered? Have you taken evidence on the working group from people like Woodlands Trust who are happy enough not to get them from Scotland because they want indigenous trees in indigenous areas, but they do really struggle with the disease that is spread by trees they can get from Amsterdam, for example?
We haven't. So the dossiers relating to prohibited products is looked after elsewhere. So there is a separate working group. The horticultural working group really stems from some of the more commercial challenges. So the people we have around the table, the businesses around the table, are typically within our space. So we haven't had connections with the Woodland Trust. The horticultural working group is currently run jointly by DEFRA and the Northern Ireland office, with DERA now involved, so I'm sure if they're listening to this, or it could be taken back to them to consider how they could look at some of those other issues as well.
Okay, thank you. David Smith.
Thank you, Chair. We've really got into the weeds as I expected we might in this session. There's a great deal of detail here, so maybe if we could sort of step back slightly and ask a question to all four of our panellists. Are there particular policy areas or sectors in which divergence between GB and NI laws might have a significant impact? So, as you think about the whole framework, what are the policy areas or sectors that you're most concerned about on divergence, to any of you?
I suppose the unknown aspect of divergence is probably causing the biggest amount of frustration and anxiety. And businesses, obviously expend all of their energy running their business. They do not have the bandwidth to be following minutiae of regulatory divergence between the UK and the EU. And it is an issue that will be given on an ongoing basis if there isn't some form of regulatory alignment. And within that, one of our asks is that there would be publication of a sort of regulatory divergence register written in very plain English so that industry could follow to see where divergence is emerging, what that means for their industry and what they need to do to comply. We think that would be extremely helpful.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I'd say that I think the EU divergence is one of the areas that whilst we have lived with and tackled to date the problems of the Windsor Framework with great success, we just don't know where we're going, and we don't know what in terms of divergence and timelines. For example, on EUDR and deforestation, the EU put their process back, but it's coming down the road. UK government are going to do something in that field, but we just don't know, and we could have a situation where essentially they're just tandem processes. So the EU are doing something, but we're not too sure about the timelines of those. We don't get very good sight of those, and then UK government are saying, well, yes, we're going to do something on that, possibly align, but it's really not too clear. When and to what extent that will happen. So, the deforestation regulations, encompass a wide range of products. So it would pose a huge administrative burden on top of an existing huge administrative burden to comply with deforestation regulations.
I mean, on the EU deforestation regulation, we have, as I said, multinational organisations. They have whole teams working on EU deforestation because of the range of products that apply. So it is requiring significant resource. They have the resource to do that, but for smaller operators and traders, it's hugely challenging.
So deforestation regulations is a particular area. Are there any other areas that you're especially concerned about the impact of? I get that, there's a general concern.
Yeah, CBAM, so the carbon border adjustment mechanism is another, and then the emissions trading scheme. So obviously in trying to reduce the emissions of maritime, the EU has an emissions trading scheme. The UK government has just closed a consultation on extending the UK emission trading scheme to domestic maritime. Again, that's another area of potential change and additional cost. And as I said, we have to cross the Irish Sea in terms of servicing the Northern Ireland market. So that would be another live example.
Before we move on, any other policy or sectoral areas that you're most concerned about on divergence?
I mean, it's recently, I suppose it's happened in practice with the General Product Safety Regulation for consumers. So that happened in December whenever that EU regulation came in. The Consumer Council doesn't proactively monitor regulatory divergence. We're a very small organisation. We don't have the legislative experience to do that. But whenever those sorts of things come in, like general product safety regulations, there's potentially an immediate consumer impact, and we saw that in December. With the likes of very small micro businesses, as an example, the crafting business, a lot of crafters in Northern Ireland immediately not being able to get goods from crafters, crafting businesses and micro businesses in the UK. So oftentimes, we work with government departments, we work with the likes of DBT and the Office for Product Safety and Standards to talk about these things, but oftentimes you don't see the actual impact until that divergence has happened.
Yeah, just on that one, as I said at the beginning, BRC has approximately 200 members. About 100 of those have shops in Northern Ireland, so there's quite a number of them that don't. But quite a number of them sell products into Northern Ireland. You don't necessarily have a retail base there. So under GPSR, they would be required to have a registered office and everything in Northern Ireland. So, but I have no means of knowing how many of them have decided that that's not worth the candle to do that. You know, again, they're mainly large businesses and selling considerable amounts of goods, so they may well make the effort, but they are large businesses, so they can do that. But there may be others who say it's very hard to get any grip on this.
On that burden of sort of expectation around additional paperwork, etc., how easy is it, would you say, for businesses to understand which new or updated EU regs are likely to apply in Northern Ireland? So, Nichola, you mentioned a regulatory divergence register, and the Federation of Small Businesses NI has suggested an office for regulatory divergence. So it is hugely challenging for businesses to monitor this, to follow it, and then to adapt. So they need to have assistance. We have a role in doing that as trade associations, but it can be so vast and complicated that it is challenging. So it is certainly daunting for business, and it's not easy to navigate at all.
I think people can perhaps be aware that something's gone down the line, but they don't really know how it's going to be applied and what the UK government response is. So there's great unknowns in it. So even if you're aware that something is changing, you're not aware of the practical implications.
Do you think there's especially the case for smaller businesses, the crafting that we were just hearing about, recognising, Neil, that you and probably Nichola too, you represent larger entities. Should the burden then for that, the divergence and communication about that fall more heavily proactively on statutory bodies to make sure that small businesses in particular, but all businesses, know what those divergences are?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you take the issue of CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, I know that other business representative colleagues in Northern Ireland have been trying for some time to find out who is the competent authority in Northern Ireland. So again, when you're aware of an issue, it is not always clear who the competent authority is for the issue. So we need clarity on that as well.
Even on occasions, the competent authority has not been aware that it is the competent authority.
It's the incompetent competent authority.
On that note, thank you, Chair.
Okay, Katrina Murray.
Yep. I'd like to look at the Trader Support Service. Certainly my understanding is that it's been operated by the same provider since it was first contracted in 2020, and that a current contractual agreement from 2026 onwards is currently underway. What's your members' experiences of using the service, and does it need a reshape? And is it currently providing best value?
So a lot of our smaller members would be reliant on the Trader Support Service to assist with customs submissions, and it is a free service. We've talked about the cumulative cost and administrative burden, so they do rely on the free service. Logistics UK did welcome the extension of the contract, and we have engaged with HMRC as it sets about to procure a new service from January 2026. But we have been clear that we would like to see improvements in the new service, that it would be more user-friendly, for example, that there would be greater reassurances around your UKIMS and EORI numbers, because we have members who are contacted about movements that they didn't make because their details have been used by someone else. So there's issues around that need to be resolved. And we would love to see improvements to the service that would reduce the burden on the haulier. Very often the haulier may not have direct contact with the buyer or the seller, but they are the go-to person when anything is missing, and there is a great degree of burden on them. And the other issue we would like to see is for the groupage movements, it can be cumbersome in trying to use TESS to process that, so we would like to see better facilitation of groupage movements as well.
Well, I just would endorse that. I think she's covered nearly all of it there. I think we would like to see the continuation of a scheme and a funded scheme to try and lessen the cost burden. A lot of my members would do a lot of it in-house, but that's not to say that a lot of them don't also rely on TSS.
Jennifer, I'm presuming that you might be dealing with a lot more of the smaller.
Absolutely. So I think we have had feedback that it is quite cumbersome, to use Nicola's word there, to work with them because of the amount of information that's required. And also, this is, as the picture I sort of painted earlier, there are multiple actors involved in this. More that you are having to deal with whilst you're having to deal with your own paperwork, plus the people with your hauliers. It paints a picture of the complexity of this and the amount of information you have to share. A common frustration I get is that often these systems, you're repeating the same amount of the same information, they don't talk to each other. So there probably is something around, actually, is all of this fit for purpose from a technology perspective? And I think probably we would find that it...
Just to come back on that bit, yeah, I think one of the colleagues from Marks and Spencer's, I think, had an article out about this a few weeks ago, whereby he was describing how they take young people into their business to then tell them that they need to go backwards in history and get their pens and papers out to comply with the sort of slightly archaic processes to deal with the Windsor Framework in general. So I think there's definitely, this could be made better through technology. We're taking photographs on seats on the backs of trucks. Those are trucks that are all GPS tracked, and yet we're taking photographs and uploading photographs and compiling vast amounts of paperwork that really, in this day and age, I've often said it's a sort of 20th century solution to a 21st century problem. In fact, it may not even be a 20th century. We really are doing this in a very archaic fashion, which is making life worse for everybody.
And on the point of digital solutions, we do believe that has a positive role to play. Neil has talked about the very manual, cumbersome process of taking photographs of seals, like the driver having to do that. Technology is advancing in the area of smart seals, which would give you pure, clear visibility right throughout the supply chain. It provides that security. So our members are keen to explore that as potential options, but they are reluctant to invest if it's not going to be an accepted form of technology by both the UK and the EU.
Okay. I was about to say, Anne-Marie, was there anything you wanted to add to that? Or?
No, not in TSS.
Well, I'd like to thank you for your time, Anne-Marie, Nichola, Neil and Jennifer, and it's been a very interesting session. So.